Hello, welcome everyone. It's so
So,
nice to have you with us for our Ask Style program. I, of course, miss seeing you in the building and miss being able to have a real lunch with you. But based on our conversations over the last few minutes, it's nice to see everyone connecting, even if it is a virtual connection and watching you see each other, though it's been many, many months since we've been able to be together in person. But really, I'm very thrilled that we have an amazing speaker today who has a fantastic presentation. I got a little sneak preview of it a few weeks ago, but Rabbi Rich Kirschen is joining us all the way from Israel, although he just told me he spent some time in Michigan, and I'm going to let him fill you in a bit on his background, but he's had a very interesting career over the years and has quite a bit to share with us today. So Rabbi Rich, I am going to actually pin you. We'll spotlight you so everyone can see your faces, and I'm going to continue to let everyone come in. I am going to ask you guys all to do me a favor and to please mute yourselves unless you are raising your hand to ask a question or have a comment or clarifying something, just so that we don't have that background noise while we are hearing our presentation. Thank you so much for being with us. And welcome to Temple Israel virtually.
Can I begin? Hi. Okay, so it's really nice to meet all of you. As you hear from my accent, I am not originally from Jerusalem. I hail from the holy city of Woodmere, Long Island. But my special connection to Michigan is after I was ordained, I worked at the University of Michigan Hillel for 5 years. And my children were born in Michigan. And actually, it's really through your community that I understood what an organized Jewish community meant. I was really knocked out by the Jewish community of metropolitan Detroit, because I grew up in New York. We didn't have a federation. And I thought federation was something out of Star Trek. So anyway, and so our kids know that they're from Michigan. I moved, after I was a Hillel director, I moved to Israel, and I've been working in what's called immersive Israel programming for young adults for many, many years. And since COVID has hit, I've decided to go back to school because there's no tourism right now, and I'm studying psychotherapy. So let's talk a little bit what I want to teach today. And it's called, the name of the series is Herzl on the Couch, which it's more of a psychodynamic approach to Israel and why Israelis behave the way they do, or why the Jewish people behave the way we do. And so today I want to talk about the reaction of power and powerlessness. I wanted to look at a few things. One, I wanted to look at the whole idea of sovereignty. What does that mean when we have Jewish sovereignty? How does that affect us in terms of our relationship with power? I also want to look at how that relationship affects our text. And finally, what that means about Jewish men, because I'm sorry to say, military for until now really had to do more with, and there are exceptions like the story of Judith and Hanukkah, but when we talk about military, we are talking about Jewish men. How did that affect the image of the Jewish man, and therefore, how did it affect the Jewish woman? So I'm going to share my screen right now, and tell me if you can see. Okay, you with me? Okay, great. Okay, so the first thing I want to explain is when I was growing up, and I grew up as a wise guy, Jewish kid in New York, my models were Groucho Marx, Separate the Art from the Artist by Woody Allen, right? The great comedians, and that's who I looked to. And that was really my approach to life. And when I went to Israel and I was a 15-year-old kid and I met my Israeli cousins, something was very, very different. They had a much tougher approach. They all wanted to join the army and be combat soldiers. Remember, I'm 57 and I have older sisters, and I was growing up after Vietnam. No one wanted to fight or go into the army, but there was also something different in our approaches. And it made me think of really Groucho Marx versus Moshe Dayan. They're representing something very different, if you will, of the Jewish male, of the Jewish approach to how we encounter the wider world. So I want to go back to the very beginning of our people. And as we know, the story of the Jewish people takes place in the land of Israel. And we know, even going back to King David, when you think about what kind of image do we have when we think of King David, we think of a warrior, right? We read in the Hebrew Bible, the song they used to sing, Saul had killed thousands, but David had killed tens of thousands, right? This is not the harp player that we think of. This is a warrior. And Israel was a kingdom, right? And that kingdom held on until 930 when the Assyrians came and took away the 10 tribes, right? We know our history. And we were left with just Judea. By the way, that's why we're called Jews, right? We're not called Jews because of Judaism. We're called Jews because if you trace our story, the story of our people, you go back to Judea, and someone from Judea was a Jew, or in Hebrew, Yehudim from Yehuda. And in 586, we know the temple was destroyed, right? We go to Babylon and we sing By the Waters of Babylon, which is a reggae song now. And we come home, right? Because the king of Persia says the Jews can come home, and we build a second commonwealth. And we are a people, right? We have sovereignty, we have an army. That's how we run, like any other country. And we know in 332, okay, the Alexander the Great conquers the land of Israel. And we know from our history, right, Alexander the Great didn't have any heirs. So he had his generals take over different parts of his kingdom. And we know the story of Antiochus, who tried to suppress the Jewish religion, and we had a rebellion. And of course, we have the image of the Maccabees. By the way, Israel loves this image of Maccabees, and we'll get to that, right? Our beer is called Maccabi. All of our sports teams are called Maccabi. Israelis are obsessed with this story. But I want to go moving further ahead, right? After the Jews become independent, we have a second commonwealth. Today, Israel is called the Third Jewish Commonwealth. The Romans come in, right? This is Peter O'Toole in that mini-series about Masada, but it's a good picture. And the Romans, you don't mess with the Italians. The Romans come in and they conquer Israel. And what do the Jewish people do? We don't just take it, right? We launch a rebellion against the Romans, which is known as the Jewish War. By the way, if you can write this down, if you have a chance, read the book. It's called The Jewish War. It's a Penguin paperback. It's written by Josephus. And the story of Josephus was he was a Jewish general fighting the Romans. And him and his men decided to commit suicide rather than surrender to the Romans. But when it was Josephus's turn, and he was the last one, he surrendered to the Romans, became a slave, lived out his life in luxury. His name is Josephus Flavius, and he wrote the story of the Jewish war against the Romans. And we have that book until today. That's why we know about Masada and what happened. But the Romans completely destroy the Jewish rebellion, as we know, and the Second Temple is destroyed in 70 AD. And the Jews are in a very difficult situation, right? Something to know about the Second Temple period of Jewish history. It's strange. It's very similar to Israel. Today, there are a lot of different groups with a lot of different approaches, and everybody is fighting for power. So here we have settlers, we have ultra-Orthodox, we have secular Jews, we have all these different Jewish groups. And in the Second Temple period, we had the priests, anybody who's a Kohen or Cohen or Katz, the Kohanim, and they were the most assimilated and closest to the Romans. They really connected to the Romans. We had the Pharisees, or as you know them, the rabbis, and their approach was, we can live with the Romans, but we need to continue to be, as we see Jewish, more traditional. And then you had the people called the Essenes. Have you ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? These were a group of mystics that left Jerusalem, lived in the desert, and then finally you had the Zealots, okay, who wanted no compromise and were willing to fight to the death against the Romans. Now, at the end of the Jewish war, most of the priests were killed. So if you're a descendant of Katz, Kohen, Kogan, it's a minority. The rabbis or the Pharisees remained alive. The Essenes disappeared in history. We don't know what happened to them. And the Zealots, most of them were killed. Okay? And that was the story of the Second Temple. But guess what? The Jews weren't done fighting. They were still warriors in their makeup, in how they saw themselves. And there was a second rebellion against the Romans 65 years after the First Jewish War. And this is known as the Bar Kokhba Rebellion. I'm setting the stage to talk about, okay, so how do we get to Groucho Marx? So the Jews launch a second rebellion against the Romans, and it's such a disaster that they are slaughtered to such a great extent, the Jews become a minority in their own country. All right, suddenly it's a different situation. And the Romans completely destroy Jerusalem. They rename it Aelia Capitolina, and they make it a circled city like all Roman cities, and they divide it into 4 quarters. Those are the 4 quarters you know today. It still has the imprint of the Roman siege, okay, the Roman destruction. They rename it Aelia Capitolina, and not only that, the Romans rename the land of Judea, and they call it Palestina, because the Romans know their history. It's insult to injury, and the ancient enemies of the Jews were the Philistines, and they call it Philistina, and we're still with the name Palestine today. And the Jews are expelled from Judea. Okay, they're in different areas of the land of Israel. They're in the Galilee, etc. But Jews are kicked out of Judea, and it is a disaster. Okay, this rebellion was an absolute disaster. So, how do we get from King David and the wars, and Josephus and the wars against the Romans? How do we get to the Jewish images of the Jewish man we know today? So I just wanted to give you one archetype, if you will. Sorry, there you go. Okay, so this is a scene from Love and Death, if you know it. Sorry, I'm just going to do that again. Okay, wrong video, sorry about that. I'm trying to get that video. Okay, that's not happening, that video, for some reason. Give me 1 second.
Do you want to put the link in the chat to me and I can try to do it from my end?
No, I got it now.
Okay.
I should have it. Yeah, I got it. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to set it up. This is I know, again, I say whenever I talk about Woody Allen, he's great to teach, but he's problematic. But this is a scene from Love and Death where Woody Allen is being challenged to a duel, but it gives you an idea of the archetype of the Jewish male.
Shall we say pistols at dawn?
Well, we can say it. I don't know what it means, but we can say it.
You have insulted the honor of Countess Alexandrovna.
Why? I let her finish first.
Her seconds will call on you.
Seconds? I never gave her seconds.
As her fiancé, my seconds will call on your seconds.
Well, my seconds will be out. Have them call on my thirds. If my thirds are out, go directly to my fourths.
Boris, he's serious. You must meet him on the field of honor.
I'm not going to duel with him. He's a marksman and a killer.
Your honor is at stake.
Hey, what is this, Slap Boris Day?
You are a war hero. Surely a duel with Anton Lebedenkov is nothing to fear.
Look, I just don't want to waste a good bullet, that's all. The kid's rash. He doesn't know what he's saying. I'll drop by his house later, give him a chance to apologize. If he doesn't, I'll move to Finland.
Okay, so You get basically, you know, oops. Hi, don't you? Okay, technology. Anyway, so you saw Woody Allen and you saw the approach. And by the way, media and film is incredibly powerful. And it's not the only archetype of the Jewish male, but the Shlemiel, the guy who doesn't want to fight. I think for many of us, grew up with that kind of understanding, and if you will, more of a diaspora approach. By no means is it the only approach, but the question is for me, how did we get there? So I wanted to look at a really amazing piece of Talmud, and it begs the question, okay, so we talked about the Jews having their own state twice, the Jews fighting the Romans, fighting the Greeks, right, with the Maccabees, the Jews fighting against the Romans. And even after they were beat the first time, they were so incredibly stubborn, the Jews say, we're not done. But then something changes. And I'm going to jump like 300 years ahead. And this is a great story in the Talmud. And let's just say, where are the Jews now, right? The Jews, after 135, become a minority in their own country. And in fact, it takes like 200, 300 years for the Romans to eventually drive. They become Byzantines eventually. They never call themselves, Romans never call themselves Byzantines. They saw themselves as Christian Romans. They eventually drive the Jews out. And really, one of the first stations of the Jewish diaspora was they went to Babylon, right? Because they had relatives there. There was a diaspora community in Babylon from the first exile. And so what happens in Babylon, we know, great academies of learning, and that's where the Talmud is written. But the Jews are still figuring out, what is our relationship to our homeland? What are our obligations? What should we do? Because we were beaten by the Romans once, we were beaten twice. And do we go back? So I'm going to read this piece of Talmud. This is from a tractate of Talmud called Ketubot, and the section is 110a, if you want to look it up on the internet. And it's a great story. So it goes like this. Rabbi Zerah had been evading Rabbi Judah because he desired to go up to the land of Israel. So you have one rabbi wanting to go to the land of Israel, and he's trying to hide from another rabbi. He knew that Rabbi Judah had expressed the following view. Whoever goes up from Babylonia to the land of Israel is transgressing a positive commandment. For it is written in the Bible, they shall be carried to Babylon, and there they shall remain until the day that I remember them. So suddenly we see it's going against a commandment to visit the land of Israel. And they use this quote that Jews need to remain until God brings them back, right? Until that day I remember them. Now, this is not the strongest halachic argument, because if you want to argue Jewish law, you need to go from the 5 books of Moses, from the Torah, not from the book of Jeremiah, but it's a proof text. And how did Rabbi Zerah respond to this proof text? Rabbi Zerah said the word they refers to the Kohanim, meaning it doesn't mean no one can go up to the land of Israel and visit, just the Kohanim, because the temple isn't rebuilt. And so Rabbi Judah, it's very Talmudic, goes back. He responds to Rabbi Zerah's interpretation, and he brings out a second quote. That's how rabbis argue with each other. They use proof texts from Hebrew Bible, which is Torah and prophets and writings. So Rabbi Judah brought out a second quote, and he said, this time from the Song of Songs, I adjure you, O maidens of Jerusalem, by gazelles or by hinds of the field, do not wake or rouse love until it please. In other words, no one should stir up the love for the land of Israel, because he's saying there's something dangerous in this. And they go on to another quote about the love of the land of Israel. And so what you get is one rabbi is saying, hey, Chevre, don't go back there. we can't go back to the land of Israel until God says we can. And there's this fight back and forth. And so this happens a lot in the Talmud. The narrator jumps in and says, hey, what's going on in this story? And he says, the Talmud answers that after this argument, here are our understandings of our relationship to going back to the land of Israel. First, and this is shocking, it's in the Talmud, the nation of Israel should not move back to the land of Israel in the form of a massive immigration. This is not exactly the most Zionist text, right? This says we don't, we don't go to Nefesh and we don't plan or we talk to the Jewish agency. We are not to move back there. And then it says something even more shocking. The Holy One, blessed be God, warned Israel that they should not rebel or take up arms against the nations of the world, meaning nice Jewish boys and girls don't fight. So here you have it. And God has warned the idolaters, nations of the world, that they should not oppress the nation of Israel too much. So that's a great question. What is too much? You can make a Zionist argument about that. But what happens for 2,000 years? We understand as a people that we are not to go back to the land of Israel. We are not to fight. And what do? We observe the mitzvot. We study Jewish law, and we patiently wait for the Messiah to bring us back home. So look at this guy, and then you think of King David or the Maccabees or the Jewish, or Josephus Flavius, who was a general against the Romans. And what happened to us? In essence, what we did is we took ourselves out of history, and we said, no more fighting. We're not going to do it. God will do it for us, which psychologically is a really empowering thing. The Romans who are keeping us out, or anybody else, it's we, in our understanding of God, will bring us back to the land of Israel. And how did we keep the land of Israel in our understandings? First of all, if you read the Jewish prayer book, it's so much about going home, right? It says, Kabetz otanu me'arba kanfot haaretz, take us home from the four corners of the earth. Even Shabbat. Let's see, I'd like to see everybody. Shabbat. What are three symbols we have? What are three symbols we have for going into Shabbat? You can unmute yourself.
Mezuzah.
Okay, that's a Jewish symbol. It's a great
The
symbol.
menorah. The
Three-
menorah.
Lighting,
You know, candelabra.
lighting candles.
Lighting candles. Okay, that's one. What else? There's three things we have usually on the table.
Wine.
Wine. Okay, and something else?
Allah.
Challah. Okay, beautiful. And why do we do that? Tradition, right? It's like, why do we do that? I don't know. It's because we're Jews. So there's an answer, actually. Candles are very new. We didn't start lighting candles till we got to Northern Europe. We used to light olive oil. And wine is vineyards. And challah is wheat. And if you take olives, vineyards, and wheat, those are the three central crops of the land of Israel. When our ancestors were going into Shabbat and wanted to remember home, they used those symbols. I always say if we were Irish, we would have Guinness, potatoes, and cabbage. It might be more fun. But we're Jews from Judea, and that's why these symbols are. So we kept the whole idea of going home. We say it so many times a day of take us home from the three corners of the earth. And that's what we did. And when you think about, who were our leaders of our community? Were they the warriors? No, they were the businessmen, because that you always need money. But they were also, it was the rabbis, right? It wasn't people of great physical strength. It was, and I grew up with this, it's not the brawn, it's the brain. But think about how it had changed and how we wrote a text that said we don't fight, and then we started to behave as in fact we don't fight. So it's an interesting evolution, if you will. And just to hit that home a little more, I gave that one away. The holiday that we had of Hanukkah, which is so big in the United States, probably because it falls, right? If it fell in August, no one would know it. And what are the two miracles of, unmute yourself, call out. What are the two miracles of Hanukkah we know? There's
That
The oil.
the oil
the
burn.
oil. It lasted 8 days, right? And there was another one.
Defeating the Greeks.
Right. We it was a military victory. And so here's my theory. Actually, it's not my theory. It's Yehoshaphat Harkabi's theory, who was a brilliant professor at the Hebrew University. But he said the following. He said, we fought one war and we lost. And then we made a disastrous second rebellion. And we lost so bad that the rabbis who survived said, we're never fighting again. And they were very scared of anything that had to do with being zealots, okay, of being warriors, because they said, this is going to be the end of us. So throughout so much of our texts, there's actually this fear of military power. So this is a great story in the Talmud. It's actually the first time we hear about the story of Hanukkah as we know it about the lights. In other words, before this text that's written in about 300 and something, we had the book of Maccabees that talked about the battle of the Jews against the Greeks. It's a very, very bloody book. And it did not get canonized into the Hebrew Bible, the book of Maccabees. I think it's in the New Testament, but not ours. And there's a reason, because that story scared the rabbis. So what's going on? Here we are in the tractate about the Shabbat. And the rabbis are very ADD. And someone says, hey, they're talking about candles, right? And candles on Shabbat leads them to candles in Hanukkah. And someone says, my Hanukkah. What is Hanukkah? And we get this story for the first time. It says, our rabbis taught Hanukkah begins on the 25th of Kislev, which are 8 nights where lamentation for the dead and fasting are forbidden. It's a holiday. Because when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled the oils inside the temple. And when the Hasmonean dynasty defeated them, the Hasmoneans made a search and found 1 cruse of oil, which lay with the seal of the high priest, but which contained sufficient oil for 1 day's lighting only. Yet a miracle occurred. And when they lit the lamp, it stayed lit for 8 days. All right. This story comes out of, this is a Baba Misa, right? Where did the rabbis get this story? So this is what I think happened. They know the story of the Maccabees. They knew the story of the Hasmoneans. They did not like these. We all learned this in Hebrew school, right? The Greek general makes one of the Jews bend down to an idol, and Mattatyahu and his son Judah kill the Jew and say, who's ever for the Lord, head for the hills. Well, these guys were zealots, and this scared the rabbis. So they didn't want a story of Hanukkah being about military victory. They wanted it to be about oil and the miracle of light. And we still have that tension today, I'll get to, in Israel. What's the miracle? Is it a military victory, or is it a miracle of lights? And that's how we have the oil. And in Israel, get to eat donuts, which is great, better than lactose. So what happens? Okay, so I'm telling you about this 2,000 years of this reaction in our text, in our psyche of, in the words of my grandma, don't fight, right? We don't, be a nice Jewish boy. And 2,000 years later, after the Jews have gone through endless pogroms, not to forget the Crusades, and constantly suffering as a people who are powerless in terms of military power. I just have to mention this. By the way, that's a generalization. The head of Muslim Spain's armies was a guy by the name of Shmuel Hanagid, who's not only a street in Jerusalem, he was the head of the Spanish armies, but for the most part, Jews did not fight. And suddenly the Zionist movement comes and they say, hey, enough with the waiting. God is not coming. And even though we know in the Talmud it said we should not organize in a mass movement to move back to Israel, we are. And the Chalutzim, with these guys, the pioneers, start to come back to Israel, and they start to work, and they start to make a Zionist revolution. And even in their songs about Hanukkah, and I think you know this song from Temple, they sing, you know the song, Mi Alevu Yisrael Otami Yineh Hen Bechodo Yakum Hagibo Goel Ha'am. What does that song mean? It makes me laugh. We sing that in synagogue. It says, in every generation there will arise up a hero. And who is that Redeemer? Well, we know from the Talmud what we read, the Redeemer was God. In the Birkat HaMazon, we say, who is the Redeemer? Goel Adonai. God is the Redeemer. God, the Messiah, will bring us back to Israel. And this song, it says, Goel, the Redeemer, Ha'am. It's a very it's a very anti-God song. I couldn't conjugate that. So it's a very anti-God idea that we sing in the synagogue, which always makes me laugh, that who is the Redeemer? It's us. It's going to be on, there's a famous saying in the Palmach, we are the silver platter upon which the Jewish state was delivered. It's going to be on our backs and our labor. So you start having this, if the rabbis reacted one way to power, the Zionists flipped the rabbis and acted another way. Now I'm going to kind of move up ahead, and I think you're supposed to do trigger warnings nowadays. I'm going to share with you a very intense poem, but it's really important to understand. In 1903, there was a pogrom in Tsarist Russia. It was in Kishinev, and 50 Jews were killed, and it got publicized all around the world. New York Times, what's going on, in Tsarist Russia. And there was a man by the name of Chaim Nachman Bialik, who is the poet laureate of the state of Hebrew poet laureate, the first one of the state of Israel. If you're going to have a Zionist revolution, and if you're going to talk about going back to Israel, and eventually get an art, you need a language, right? Great thing about Hebrew is, there was a word for sorrow, but there was no word for shoelaces. And that's where Eliezer ben Yehuda comes on the scene. And Bialik becomes a hero because he writes beautiful modern Hebrew and prose, but even more beautiful Hebrew poetry. And he's very well respected. He lives in Odessa, and they say to him, the Jewish establishment, Bialik, go to Kishinev and find out what happened. Write us what happened. And Bialik goes to Kishinev, okay? And he writes a poem called The City of Slaughter. And it's absolutely shocks, it wakes up the Jewish community, because he does not say, Oy Gewalt Yidden, they're killing us like innocents. He writes the following, and I'll read it. It's a very intense poem. He writes, descend then to the cellars of the town, there where the virginal daughters of thy folk were found, where 7 heathen flung a woman down, the daughter in the presence of her mother, the mother in the presence of her daughter, before slaughter, during slaughter, and after slaughter. And he goes on to say about Jewish men, crushed in their shame, they saw it all. They did not stir nor move. They did not pluck their eyes out. They beat not their brains against the wall. Perhaps, each watcher had it in his heart to pray, a miracle, O Lord, and spare my skin this days. Those who survived this foulness, who from their blood awoke, beheld their life polluted, the light of their world gone out. How did their menfolk bear it? How did they bear this yoke? They crawled forth from their holes. They fled to the house of the Lord. They offered thanks to him, the sweet benedictory word. The Kohanim sallied forth. To the rabbi's house they flitted. Tell me, Rabbi, tell, is my own wife permitted? The matter ends and nothing more, and all is as it was before. Come now, and I will bring thee to their lairs, the privies, jakes, and pigpens, where the heirs of Hasmoneans lay, with trembling knees, concealed and cowering. The sons of the Maccabees, the seed of saints, the signs of the lions, who crammed by scores in all the sanctuaries of their shame, so sanctified my name. It was the flight of mice they fled. The scurrying of roaches was their flight. They died like dogs, and they were dead. So, what is Bialik saying? Right? I mean, and everybody was shocked because he didn't say what we usually say. Oh, you Gewalt, we're innocent. How can they attack us? He said, Jewish men. Who are you, men? Are you mice or are you men? Where are you? Where were you? And this is basically a big part, if you will, of Zionism. This is a big part of Zionism. And it reminded me, and some of you are my age or older, does anybody remember this in the comic books? The Charles Atlas bodybuilding ad they had in the back? I can't see some people, but that's essentially Zionism, right? There's a guy and he's on the beach and someone kicks sand in his face and
Right.
big, what?
I remember.
You remember? Okay, great. So everybody saw that, right? I never sent away for it, but I wanted to. And the big bully, threatens him, and his girlfriend says, "Oh, little boy, don't let that bother you." And he sends away for Charles Atlas's bodybuilding kit, right? And he gets muscles. And that is Zionism, right? Essentially, what happens, Bialik says, you weaklings, you scaredy cats. And what it does actually is the Jewish community that is growing in the land of Israel until then always had Arab watchmen protect their communities. And so basically you have it since the Bar Kokhba rebellion, an armed group of Jews fighting as military men starting in 1909. So we took a break for about, and this again is a generalization, but we took a break until 2,000 years, until we start, 1900 years, until Jews started fighting again. And it's amazing, but it's a piece of literature. Bialik's poem really hit hard. Hashomer, the watchman, grows into what's become the Haganah, which was the pre-state military underground that protected the Jewish community, which of course became the Israel Defense Forces. Moving ahead, but important to point out, the Holocaust, as we know, not everybody went like sheep to the slaughter. In Israel, it's known as Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, and memory of the martyrs who fought and died in the Holocaust. But we had no military might at that point, and it was the ultimate lesson in power and powerlessness, right? No one was there for us in the end. We were on our own, and we didn't have machine guns, and we didn't have F-16s, etc. And so what's so interesting, I find, is that even after World War II, and even after 6 million Jews are killed, you still had many Jews, by the way, Hebrew Union College, my alma mater, that were quite ambivalent about Jews going for power, right? Because we were the ethics of the prophets. We were, a people of peace. And so after there are two texts I want to look at that were written after the Holocaust. And this is by a guy by the name of Judah Magnus. Anybody hear of him? He's a Reform rabbi. He moved to Israel. He actually started the Hebrew University, and a fascinating guy. He thought that we shouldn't start a Jewish state. And he actually formed a group with Martin Buber called Brit Shalom, and it believed in a binational state with the Arabs. Didn't gain too much ground, but he writes the following, and this is on the eve of Israeli independence. He says, if we cannot find ways of peace and understanding, if the only way of establishing the Jewish national home is upon the bayonets of some empire, our whole enterprise is not worthwhile. And it is better that the eternal people that has outlived many a mighty empire should possess its soul in patience. It is one of the great civilizing tasks before the Jewish people to enter the promised land, not in the Joshua way. If you have a chance to read the book of Joshua, it's all about ethnic cleansing. It's in our Bible, right? We kill everybody. He says, not in the Joshua way, but bringing peace and culture, hard work, and sacrifice and love, and a determination to do nothing that cannot be justified before the conscience of the world. I work with a lot of college students, and it's interesting because they love that. We can't do anything that cannot be justified in front of the conscience of the world. We are an ethical tikkun olam, right? And David Ben-Gurion has a very different approach. He says, or said, in a period of power politics, those who are in power become hard of hearing and respond only to the roar of cannons. And the Jews in the diaspora have no cannons. In order to survive in this evil world, the Jewish people need cannons more than justice. And I always have Israeli young people have a very different approach, and they take this quote from Ben-Gurion. So it's interesting. Does might make right? Finally, and just in terms of moving ahead with our relationship to power, in 1948 we get military power for the first time in 2,000 years, and it emboldens us. But nothing like the 1967 war to kind of change our core beliefs, internal core beliefs that Jews can fight is the 6-Day War, right? Not only can Jews fight, we can fight better than anyone else. Not only can we fight, we can do it quicker in 6 days. And this changes the world's understanding of us and our own understanding of us. Did anybody have this poster?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. I was a kid. This poster came out after 1967. And what's it saying? It's saying underneath what you might have thought was the Woody Allen Schlemiel is someone who could really, we're super Jews. And it's the dichotomy of, are we the wandering Jew who suffers and waits in patience, who hasn't fought, or suddenly we're this newfound power? Now, being powerless is not good. I mean, you can make the argument, maybe it is, maybe like Judah Magnus. I'll say, to be powerless is a very dangerous thing in this world. But when you have power, you also have to be very careful. And Israel, that I've been living in for close to 20 years, is a society that's a lot about the military, right? Kids stand at attention for Yom HaShoah, for Memorial Day of the Holocaust and Memorial Day of those who died in Israel's wars from the time they're 5. They're socialized. And, there's good and there's bad, right? But I want to talk about, the dangers of a society where every kid knows to be a fighter. By the way, I couldn't resist. This is my kid. And I'm very proud of him. But I see how running around with I served in the Army, but not very long. I was old. But I saw it. Running around with a machine gun really does get that Jewish testosterone going. But it also creates a culture that, as the Israeli army says, if force doesn't work, use more force. It's not the delicate tikkun olam culture. And once you have one of the best armies in the world, how do you balance power and ethics? And so if there's one question I have is, it's easy to be ethical when you are powerless. The real test of ethics is when you have power. And I think this is something that we wrestle with back and forth. Whether you have going all the way back to, Do you have the image of Ehud Barak or do you have the image of Jerry Seinfeld? And there are pros and cons to both kind of Jewish approaches. So I'll end with this. I'm not going to end with this text, and I have one more. We'll hopefully have time for questions. This is a really beautiful text by Yitz Greenberg, if you know him from Cloud, Rabbi Irving Greenberg. And he wrote, many people are devastated when they see Jewish hands dirtied with the inescapable blood and guilt of operating the world. The classic Jewish self-image, the innocent sinned against sufferer, is shattered. When under the influence of modern values, Zionists set out to create a Jewish state, most Jews were neutral, if not opposed. The illusion of ethical perfectionism grows out of the record of millennial powerlessness, whose results are projected incorrectly into the new reality. A normal country, let alone one like Israel, that is continually threatened, will not survive if it ties its hands with absolute moral strictures and does not adjust to the pressure of power and threats posed by its enemies. Jewish powerlessness is absolutely incompatible with Jewish existence, but Jewish power is incompatible with absolute Jewish purity, right? So I think this is the stuff we talk about all the time when we talk about Israel. By the way, to think about young people. People say, I'm really uncomfortable with the way Israel runs its army, with the things that the Israeli army does. We do some terrible things. I mean, my kid told me, so we have an occupation going on, and you can give all kinds of reasons why we need this occupation. But when you go into a Palestinian home at 3 o'clock in the morning and make everybody lie out on the ground with their identity card out, and there are kids running around screaming in wet pajamas because they're traumatized, those people are going to hate you. And yet on another level, when you find all of the guns and ammunition that they were planning to use for a Hamas house, it's very, very confusing. And I'm trying to be descriptive rather than prescriptive, but it's really, really problematic. And to put 20-year-olds in that situation of having to break down the door at 3 o'clock in the morning and pull people out of their house. It's very hard to have an enlightened, nice occupation. On the other hand, I don't want missiles in my living room. It's really, really tough. And I think that's so much of the conversation surrounding Israel in general. But I also always think of young people. My kids have cousins in Madison, Wisconsin. And the cousins are really uncomfortable with the Israeli army, really uncomfortable about how they feel about Israel. And my kids say, I want to see you do 1 hour of guard duty, and then we'll talk. And it's really a clash of two parts of the Jewish family and two realities. So I want to show one last clip. I think I'm doing okay with time. And let me see if I can set this up. Okay, great. Ooh, that worked. All right, has anybody seen the movie Munich, written by Larry Kushner and directed by Steven Spielberg? This is the story of after the Munich Olympics massacre, Golda Meir said, enough is enough. We're not taking this sitting down. And she commissioned an Israeli hit squad to go after every assassin or any person who had to do with the assassination of the Israeli athletes. And the group was known as Black September. And this is the film about the Israeli squad going after it. And it's complicated. So this is after they've killed the first Palestinian terrorist, and they're talking about celebrating, and it's complicated. Okay, please.
Drink some wine. We're celebrating.
That old Pesach story. Angels are rejoicing because the Egyptians have just drowned in the Red Sea.
I didn't say we're rejoicing. I said we're celebrating.
And God said to the angels, why are you celebrating? I've just killed a multitude of my children.
You didn't finish the story. The angels respond to God. They say, God, we're celebrating Because when the people hear what happened to the Egyptians, they'll understand your point.
Which was?
Don't fuck with the Jews. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm not celebrating. I'm goddamn rejoicing.
Okay, so that was Daniel Craig, right? Always good to have him as Israeli. What's happening here? They're celebrating after the assassin. Oh, here we go again. Hi. Sorry about that. Okay, we're good. They're celebrating because they just killed the first Palestinian terrorist. And one of the members of the hit team brings up the Midrash, if you are familiar with it, the story about after the Egyptians, read that this week, we're reading that this week. Hey, good timing. After the Egyptians are drowned in the sea, the angels sing God's praise, and God says, I just killed all my children. Why are you singing my praise? And Daniel Craig comes by and says, you know, what's the message here? What are people around the world going to say? Don't mess with the Jews, right? Says it more harif, more picante. But he says, don't mess with the Jews, which on some level is a message of the Jewish people in the 20th century, right? You know, I'm sitting here in Jerusalem and we are armed to the teeth, right? We have 200 nuclear bombs. We have an army, a navy, an air force. And I'm not waving the Zionist flag. I'm not saying it's a bad thing either, but I'm saying if you look at our story, and of course now everybody hated us when we were powerless, and of course now everybody hates us that we have power. We're not. Timing is not our strong point. Someone said something in the text, but I'd like to unmute you guys. Has the popular image of the Jewish male outside Israel changed since Woody Allen? It seems we have made a Belsky brother tour. It seems we have had to make the Belsky. Are you asking, like, in order to make the Jewish male look macho, we had to use Daniel Craig?
I don't know if you can hear me, but
Yeah, you can.
What I meant there was the popular image of the Jew outside of Israel doesn't seem to have changed much. Daniel Craig was cast as the Bielski brother. A recent movie with Adam Schindler doesn't portray a Jewish man in a very favorable light. And I'm wondering, outside of Israel, if we kind of feel that we're successful relatively to where we were, that we kind of have to denigrate our own image of, particularly of Jewish maleness.
It's a great question. I mean, it's. You can look at Larry David, and it depends, who gets the spotlight. But I like Larry David, but he can be tough, but his weapon is sarcasm and humor, right? And yes, and because of the situation Israel's in. By the way, I always thought about we're surrounded, and people really would like to destroy us, from Hezbollah to Iran to many other people. We have no choice, and that's why the society has developed the way it did. It's interesting to see American Jews are known, if you look at comedy and show business and, business, etc., and science, but generally, yes, I know there are Jews who serve in the American Army, and I would never, that's important, but it's not an overwhelming number of the population, right? I think 95% of all Jewish kids go to college, right? 95% of all Jewish kids do not enlist in the Marines. So, maybe there's a cultural piece. By the way, I think it does go back to our historical situation. I got it from my grandparents, right? My grandparents were traumatized in World War I. They were really old because the Russians came in and were doing ethnic cleansing. World War II was worse, but the Russians came in and did ethnic cleansing, and they were very scared people. My grandmother used to say to us, she moved to America, she knew that much, but she would say, don't go nowhere, don't go anywhere. So I think because in diaspora, you can still have that non-fighting image. In Israel, you, for the most part, don't have a choice. Although not to make Israel monolithic, right? We have David Grossman. If you've seen, David Grossman is a very thoughtful, sensitive writer. We have A.B. Yehoshua. So there's not only, but I'm, kind of talking in this terms. So it's neither here nor there, but it's interesting how your situation will affect the perception of Jewish maleness, and then how text will affect us as well, going back and forth. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? How are you seeing played out in America? And by the way, I can ask you, given the resurgence of anti-Semitism, given the concern about right-wing groups who are possibly armed, given that you live in Michigan, do you feel something's going to change in your community, or has to change it? Has to change? Will you hire people to guard your synagogue, or will you train young Jewish people from the synagogue? Are you all typing? Okay, I'm waiting for it. Anyway, that's.
So someone has.
Oh, that's nice. You have training from FBI years ago with Shomrim. Okay, interesting. I mean, hopefully your country will move in a more, peaceful direction. I mean, I read the news too, but there's disconcerting, how is your reaction, maybe different than Israelis' reaction. Okay, we're at 8 o'clock. I hope that you were able to kind of follow the path of I hope that you were able to see the path as like going back all the way to the first Jewish Commonwealth, and being a people like other peoples. Once we went into diaspora and we had a different historical situation, it required an internal psychological change, and then there was both a historic revolution, but I also think a psychological revolution to change that. And by the way, don't think Israel didn't work hard at the beginning of creating this, macho Israeli guy, who has a tractor and a gun and, is a tan sabra. By the way, a long time ago, the UJA used to show these films. They would show pale people making aliyah from the diaspora, and suddenly they were tan, muscular farmers dancing the hora. And by the way, part of this is internalized anti-Semitism, right? What people said about us, we were weak, we couldn't fight, we were, stooped over and pale and sinister. Suddenly, we look to the other cultures and we try to make that transformation. So it is all very complex. There's a difference between Zionist Haggadah. Yes. Oh, you know that Haggadah. Someone just said there's a difference. There's a Zionist Haggadah that has all of these kind of strong figures that, shows a different kind of Jewish approach. Okay, but so this will really be the last comments. What I find interesting here, living here, is I think when I was a young person, I was really impressed by all these, you notice how Israeli men talk in that false deep voice? They all talk like this. I have a friend, and he moved here when he was 17 years old, and he joined the paratroopers, and he's been living here for years. And I called him up, and I hear, hello. And I said, John, it's Rich. And I hear, oh, hi, Rich. And his voice jumped up like 4 octaves. I get a kick sometimes yes, sometimes no, but I see how purposefully this society wanted to make sure that Jews can fight again. And there's an advantage to that, and there's a disadvantage to that. And it's interesting for you guys to reflect, what are the values of your society? What are the messages you send your young people? I know, grew up in Camp Eisner and I worked with Nifty in Israel for many years, that it was so much about being a good person. And what does it mean now if you not only have to be a good person, you might have to be a tough person, which doesn't always feel as easy as it can. So that's the shiur for tonight. You're not speaking, so it's a little, but if you have anything, final things, there's a different.
Well, Rich, I want to thank you. I think it's really interesting to look through visuals, through Jewish texts, through some movies at the evolution in terms of how Jewish men in particular are portrayed. And also for us to think about sort of going forward as we see things, as movies come out, as books come out, as illustrations come out, to really think about the purpose behind them and how we can understand what that role is. So thank you for sharing this presentation with us. I really appreciate you being here. If anyone has any final thoughts, questions, comments, you are welcome to unmute at this point. I'm going to stop our recording here.